Hey guys, tonight we begin with a kind of story that almost disappeared. Not because it wasn't tragic, but because the one at the center of it was just a child. She left behind no letters, no last words, not even a drawing, just a name, and a silence that lasted for centuries. Her name was Dorothy Good. She was 4 years old, and they said she spoke to the devil. Not a myth, not a ghost story. This happened in a cold little town where fear wore the face of righteousness, and even the smallest voice could be accused of witchcraft. No one saved her, not the church, not the courts, not her mother, because her mother was shackled too. So, before you close your eyes tonight, before you drift off completely, stay, because once you hear what happened in Salem, in that long, frozen winter of 1692, you'll never forget her name again. It always begins with quiet, not a scream, not fire, not even prayer, just the kind of stillness that settles over fields after snowfall, where the breath of the earth seems to pause and listen. In Salem Village, Massachusetts, that kind of quiet came often not because the world was at peace, but because people had grown used to watching each other in silence, eyes peeking behind shutters, hands still, mid-stitch, when footsteps passed too slowly. And in the winter of 1692, the silence began to shiver. It started with two girls, Abigail Williams, age 11, and her cousin Betty Paris, age 9. They lived in the parsonage in the house of Reverend Samuel Paris, a stern man who believed the devil was not a metaphor. But a neighbor, the girls began to twitch, to moan, to speak in tongues no one understood. They crawled under furniture and claimed invisible hands pulled at their skin. And when the village leaned in, wondering, whispering, the girls pointed. They said names, 3 at first, then more. One of the names they whispered was Dorothy Good. She was 4 years old. She had not spoken out of turn. She had not stolen bread or mimicked scripture. But her mother, Sarah Good, was already under suspicion, poor, outspoken, often seen muttering to herself. That was enough. And in Salem, suspicion was louder than fact. Dorothy was questioned, not in court, not by scholars, but by men who believed her silence was guilt, and her innocence a trick of the devil. They asked if she had a familiar spirit. If she had seen her mother fly, they said she confessed. But she was 4. She said yes to many things, to hunger, to fear, to whatever stopped the questions. A jailer later recalled she spoke of a snake with 2 legs that came to her at night. Was it fantasy? Was it something she heard? Or something she'd invented in the darkness of her cell, just to feel less alone? Historians still debate whether Dorothy truly confessed, or whether her words were reshaped by adult hands pressed and twisted like dough into something damning. What is not debated is this: she was imprisoned, she was shackled, her mother was hanged, and Dorothy remained in that jail for months. She lost weight. She stopped speaking. When they finally let her out, she was not the same. Few records tell what became of her. A line in a ledger, a mention in a petition, but no story of what she dreamed about in the dark, or whether she ever played again, or whether, years later, when wind brushed against her neck, she thought of snakes, or of the questions she was too young to understand. Some said she was possessed, some said she was saved, but no one ever said she was just a child. And perhaps that's where it begins, not with fire or brimstone, but with forgetting what a child's voice is supposed to sound like. Not an oracle, not a threat, but a question, unfinished. The village would go on to accuse many more, and Dorothy, her story would slip beneath the louder ones. But in the quiet, in the hush between snowfalls, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the echo of a child saying yes, not because she understood the question, but because no one had ever taught her to say no. The wind in Salem did not howl. It crept, between eaves, under doors, through the wide slats of wooden houses built more for discipline than comfort, and it carried something with it. Not illness, not fire, but fear, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that settles on shoulders like a cold hand, just heavy enough to notice, but never quite visible. In the weeks after Dorothy was jailed, more names were spoken. Some were whispered from behind cupped hands. Others were shouted from pulpits. Each one made the village a little smaller, a little quieter. One of the accused was Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother, known for kindness and prayer. She had never spoken out, never cursed, never threatened, but she was deaf. And in court, when she failed to respond to a question quickly enough, They called it proof. The people said her silence was defiance, that her age made her wise in the devil's ways, that even a frail woman could command spirits unseen. They brought her in chains, and Dorothy saw her just once. In the courtyard, Rebecca was looking upward, not in hope, but in thought. Dorothy didn't speak, but she remembered the woman's hands. Not clawed, not trembling, just folded in her lap, as if she were still sitting by her hearth, waiting for tea. Rebecca was found guilty. Her family begged for mercy. Even the governor hesitated, but the court, driven by momentum, by whispers, by the desire to be certain, moved forward. Rebecca was hanged in July. What few know is this: her body was not left in the official burial site for witches, the shallow, rocky slope behind Gallows Hill. Her sons came at night. They carried her home, wrapped her in linen, and buried her in silence beneath a tree where her grandchildren had once played. The next morning, the spot was covered with leaves, and though no marker stood, those who knew remembered. Historians still debate whether the court knew of this removal and allowed it quietly, or whether the family risked their lives to do it in defiance. But somewhere deep in the jailhouse, Dorothy stirred in her sleep. She did not know Rebecca's name, only that the air had changed, that the guards moved more heavily, that her mother no longer cried, not out loud. Sarah Good would die soon after. But before that, she was asked if she wished to confess, to save her soul, to redeem her daughter. She said nothing at first. Then finally, with a voice dry from days without water, she said, "You're killing me because I'm poor. You're killing my child because you're afraid of her quiet." The men did not write those words down, but one of them, it said, blinked twice before returning to his ink. Sarah was hanged the next morning. Dorothy remained behind, and the air around her grew thicker, not with smoke or cold, but with absence. No more lullabies, no one to hold her hand, only walls, and in the corner, a small piece of straw, twisted into the shape of a doll, not by her, but left by another child who had stayed in that cell long before. It had no face, only thread for arms, and a knot where a heart might be, so she held it, not because she believed in magic, but because no one had given her anything else to hold. There is a strange thing about fear. Once it finds a voice, it rarely stays small. It becomes contagious. And in 1692, the fear that had begun in Salem Village spilled like ink into every fold of the colony, to Andover, Ipswich, Gloucester, and beyond. Every twitch of the eye, every misremembered prayer, every cow that wandered off, or child who cried in the night, became evidence. Soon, no one asked if witches were real, only who and how many. The jail that held Dorothy grew full, stone and straw and silence, and in the chaos, names piled upon names. One girl, Ann Putnam Jr., 12 years old, accused 62 people. Her voice, once soft, became law, and when she cried, or screamed, or collapsed, entire lives fell with her. People believed her because she wept, because she was a child. They did not ask why children were suddenly the arbiters of death. And in that same season, Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer, refused to speak, not because he was guilty, not because he was afraid, but because he would not let the court take his land. If he remained silent, his estate would pass to his sons. So when they pressed him, all not with questions, but with stones, he still did not answer. They laid him on the ground, placed a board on his chest, and stacked rocks, one by one, until his ribs cracked like old wood. His last words were not curses, only more weight. That, too, the court wrote down. Dorothy did not know his name, but she felt the earth that day tremble slightly under her straw, not because of the rocks, but because something unspoken had been broken. Historians still debate whether Giles Corey's death was the turning point, the moment the townspeople began to see the horror for what it was. Some say the air changed that afternoon, that the crows near the fields flew in spirals, as if confused, that even the magistrates hesitated, hands hovering over their own quills, as if the ink itself had grown heavy. In jail, Dorothy clutched her faceless straw doll a little tighter. She had stopped crying weeks ago, not because she was brave, but because crying did not bring food, or sunlight, or her mother back, and she had begun to dream, not of devils or witches, but of doors. Doors that opened not with keys, but with names, her mother's, Rebecca's, even Giles', whose name she never heard aloud, but somehow still carried in the part of her that remembered pain without understanding it. One night, The jailer, a man with cracked boots and a cough that never went away, left a crust of bread by her door. Not by accident. He did not speak to her. But he did not take the doll away either. And for a moment, in that cold space where walls met floor, something close to mercy passed through. Outside, the trials continued, but inside the silence, a child still breathed. There are ends that arrive like storms loud, clear, undeniable, and then there are ends like this one, soft, ashy, uncertain. By the winter of 1693, the special court had been disbanded. The accusations no longer thundered. The girls stopped performing, and the silence they left behind was heavier than the panic that had come before. People began to speak of mercy, not in churches, but in corners, not in proclamations, but in lowered voices. Some of the imprisoned were released. Others waited longer, but no one came for Dorothy. She had no advocates, no wealth, no last name that mattered in courts or pulpits. Her mother was gone, her story, a footnote. The jailer had stopped locking her cell, not because he believed she was innocent, but because she no longer moved. Some days she hummed, a sound with no tune, no beginning, no end, only a thread of noise, to keep herself tethered. And one morning, as frost bloomed on the jailhouse door, and a crow landed on the sill, as if summoned, a voice called her name. Not a sermon, not a sentence, just her name. Once, she blinked. She had not heard it spoken aloud in weeks, perhaps months. The man at the door did not kneel, did not smile. He held a folded paper in one hand, and breadcrumbs in the other. He said she was to be released. No explanation, no apology, just the word, go. Historians still debate what prompted her release, whether it was an administrative oversight, an act of conscience by a local official, or part of a wider, quiet effort to erase the most shameful traces of the trials. But Dorothy left. She did not run. She did not thank. She stepped outside as if walking into someone else's memory. The snow had softened the world. The tree where her mother once stood was bare. The homes she passed did not look at her. They closed their shutters slowly, like eyes pretending to sleep. She went to no one. No record shows who took her in. If anyone did, no journal says whether she ever spoke of the months in stone and straw, whether she cried or laughed again, or found the doll she'd left behind. But that winter, a baker in Salem noted in the margins of his order book, a small child came by, said nothing, took nothing, left behind a handprint in flour. No name was written, but the date matched. And maybe that was her, not asking for food, not claiming truth, just marking the world, once more, before disappearing again. Some stories do not end when the door closes. They linger, in the pages not turned, in the words not spoken, in the names no one says aloud anymore. After Dorothy left the jail, the village did not rejoice. It did not crumble. It did not confess. It simply continued. Children returned to their chores. Fires were lit each dusk. Bread was baked. Sermons were preached. But something in the rhythm had changed. There was a pause now. When someone coughed at the wrong time during service, a breath held too long, when a dog barked in the night, and though the court had ended, though no more witches were sentenced, the village knew better than to call itself healed. That spring, a petition appeared, signed by 22 people, asking for forgiveness on behalf of Rebecca Nurse. They wrote, "She was a woman of blameless life, and we fear a grievous error has been made." It was not the last. Over the months to come, more petitions followed. Some were refused, some were lost. Others were quietly accepted and locked away where no one would read them. And one by one, some names were cleared, not all, not quickly, but enough to say that even in silence, there was shame. Historians still debate whether these petitions were born of guilt, politics, or fear not fear of witches. But of history's judgment, no monument was raised, no memorial read aloud. But in 1697, 5 years after the first accusations, the colony declared a day of fasting, not to thank God for deliverance, but to mourn. They called it a day of prayer and humiliation, an awkward phrase, too formal, too late. And yet, they said the names, not all, not with feeling, but aloud. It was the first time many of those words had returned to the air, no longer as curses, but as confessions. Dorothy's name was not among them. She was too small, too quiet, too forgotten. But her mother's was, and others who had shared her straw and shadow. They did not return, but their names stood up. That night, the church was half empty. Some could not bear it. Some refused to believe it had ever happened. But those who stayed said the air felt different when they left. Lighter. No, not yet. But still, different. Years pass quietly when no one speaks of them. And in Salem, time did not rush. It settled, like dust on shutters never opened again. Like moss growing over names carved in haste. Children grew into mothers, accusers became elders, and the village slowly changed its face, without ever fully changing its heart. The jail where Dorothy had sat was torn down and built over. A workshop, perhaps, or a storehouse. No plaques, no memory carved in stone. But the earth remembered, and sometimes, when the wind came from the north, old women said they could still feel the cold of that floor through their boots. Not pain, just a whisper, a chill where warmth should have been. Dorothy was gone by then. No records traced her past her release. No marriage, no death, just absence. But her name flickered now and then, in petitions, in the edge of a sermon, in the quiet questions children asked. When the older ones thought they had forgotten, one such name was Ann Putnam Jr., the girl who had pointed most, who had cried and accused, and brought the court to life with her fear. She lived long enough to look back. In 1706, 14 years after the trials, she stood before the congregation and said, "It was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me. I desire to lie in the dust and be humbled for it." She apologized, not for one name, but for many, not with tears, but with a voice that had grown older, quieter, tired. Historians still debate whether her apology was sincere, or scripted, urged by the church, or born from guilt too long held. But in that moment, she named her sorrow. She did not mention Dorothy. Perhaps she forgot. Perhaps she never knew her name. But the apology rippled anyway, outward, softly, like the echo of something once shouted, now spoken again in a whisper. Dorothy may never have heard it, or maybe she did. Not as sound, but as release, a thread loosened, a knot untied, a weight that no longer pressed quite so tightly. On the ribs of memory, paper can sleep for a very long time, tucked in attics, pressed between books no one reads, stacked in town halls, tied with string, collecting the dust of centuries. But every so often, someone looks, and when they do, the paper begins to breathe again. In the early 1800s, a schoolteacher in Danvers, once known as Salem Village, began gathering records. Not grand ones, not the words of governors or generals, but the scribbled notes of clerks, ministers, jailers, and in one worn ledger, between 2 pages stained with ink and time, was a name, not bold, not centered, just there. Dorothy Good, daughter of Sarah, age 4, and beside it, in tight script, imprisoned March, release date unknown. No other comment. The teacher copied the name into his notebook. He underlined it twice, and then he paused. Something about that line, so small, so flat, seemed heavier than all the rest. He wrote her story as best he could, published a small pamphlet. Most readers skipped that part. They wanted drama, fire, theatrics, but there were others. Quiet readers who stopped when they saw her age and wondered, what happens to a 4-year-old who is told she is cursed? What shape does that leave in her memory, in her hands, in the way she walks through a world that once locked her away? Historians still debate whether Dorothy lived long afterward, changed her name, or vanished into poverty and silence. There are theories. A woman named Good appears in a census decades later. Alone, unwed, her age uncertain. A faded record lists a midwife in Newburyport who claimed she had once known the gallows by sight. And in a cemetery whose name has faded from maps, a stone marked simply D.G. lies beneath a bent oak. No one knows, and perhaps that's why she haunts. Not as a ghost, but as a space left open, a child-sized shadow, never quite filled in. And yet, her name began to return, first in essays, then in novels, then in the whispered voices of historians who found themselves repeating the same line. She was only 4, too young to speak clearly, too young to defend, too young to be called anything but child. And still, they called her something else. Not every story survives through records. Some stories survive because someone, somewhere, could not bear the idea of a child vanishing without a trace. And so, they imagined her back into being. In the 19th century, during the slow rise of Romanticism, poets began to write about Salem, not the town, not the trials, but the feeling of a place that once forgot how to listen to reason. They wrote of ghostly bells, of mist over gallows, of names half spoken by wind through the trees, and somewhere, nestled within those verses, a girl appeared. She had no dialogue, but she had eyes, and they were always described the same way. Too old for their years. She was not called Dorothy. Sometimes she had no name at all, only the small one, or the child beneath the floor, or she who listened while the world forgot. Historians still debate how much of this was invention, and how much was memory softened into myth if the poets read court records, or if they simply touched the edges of an old grief still lingering in the collective air. One writer, a woman from Boston, published a short piece called The Straw Doll. In it, a young girl speaks to a figure made of straw and string. She does not speak to the jailer, or the judge, or her mother, only to the doll. And in the story's final line, the doll blinks. No one ever proved the story was based on Dorothy. The name never appears, but it was reprinted, and read, and remembered. And one winter evening in 1903, a school in Salem hosted a poetry reading. Among the verses read aloud, a small child recited from memory a stanza that began, "She sat with the silence," and the silence sat back. Afterward, someone asked the teacher what it meant, and the teacher said, "It means that some things stay with us, even when we do not say their names." And perhaps that's all Dorothy ever was. In the years that followed, not a ghost, not a footnote, but a presence, a pause, the breath before a story is told. Time does not erase, it only smooths the edges, until the wounds no longer scream, but still leave a shape in the stone. In the 20th century, Salem began to reckon, not loudly, not publicly at first, but in letters, plaques, quiet museum rooms painted soft gray. The Salem Witch Museum opened in 1972. It did not glamorize. It did not mock. It told the story of the trials with a kind of weary reverence, as if history itself had begun to mourn. And somewhere near the back, among the panels of names and dates, a small card was placed, white, plain, with one line, "Dorothy Dorcas Good age 4, jailed, survived." No photo, no embellishment, just truth, the kind that arrives late, but still matters. Historians still debate whether she should be officially included on memorial lists of the victims, since she wasn't executed, and because so little is known about what happened to her. But one curator, a woman with a voice like folded cloth, insisted that her name remain. She sat in a cell. She once said, "And she was 4. That's enough." Visitors began to ask, who was she? What happened to her? And always, there were more questions than answers. But that didn't stop the remembering. In 1992, 300 years after the trials, Salem erected a memorial to the 20 who were killed. It sits in a quiet spot near Charter Street Cemetery. Stone benches bear the names, small ledges for flowers, a space for silence. Dorothy's name is not carved there, but almost always, someone leaves a single small doll. On one of the benches, a handmade figure of straw and twine, sometimes with a ribbon, sometimes not. No one knows who began it. The museum does not claim it. The city does not police it. But it continues, as if her story had become not just history, but ritual, a way of saying, we remember the smallest among us. We remember what was done, and what should never be done again. Now we step into the spaces where children learn, and where, slowly, the name of a forgotten girl becomes more than just a name. It becomes a mirror, held up to every generation that dares to teach truth gently. Some names return not through monuments, but through classrooms, soft chalk against blackboard, fingers flipping through thin textbook pages, a teacher's voice pausing just long enough that one child lifts their head. It began, as most things do, with one question: were there really children accused in the Salem trials? And the teacher, unsure at first, went home that night and searched, past the better-known names, past the executions, past the sermons, and there, in a footnote, she found Dorothy Good. She read it twice, then again, and something in her chest folded inward. The next day, she brought her students outside. They sat in a circle under the trees. No PowerPoint, no quiz, just her voice. She told them about a girl who had once been 4, who had been questioned by men in dark coats, who had said yes to stop the questions, who had been locked away. Not for what she did, but for what others feared. And when she finished, the students didn't speak. One child raised their hand and said, "What happened to her after?" And the teacher said, "We don't know." Another asked, Why didn't anyone stop it? The teacher didn't answer that one. Not right away. Historians still debate how early education should address the Salem trials, how much to tell, when to tell it, and whether children can truly understand the depth of fear and injustice. But some believe the children understand more than we give them credit for, that they know what it means to be afraid and not believed, to be small in a room full of larger voices. And so, Dorothy's story began to appear in syllabi, in children's versions of Salem retellings, always short, always spare, just a paragraph, just a line, but that line did something. It sat in quiet minds and stayed, and some children went home that day. Not scared, but still, the way still water holds a reflection, and one of them, many years later, would become a judge, and another, a poet, and another still, just a parent who remembered to listen, when their child said something that didn't quite make sense. And maybe that's what her story became. Not a warning, not a ghost, but a small light carried forward, in the careful hands of those who now knew better. Even in towns that try to forget, roots remember. They twist deep beneath sidewalks and cellar stones, beneath parking lots and post offices, carrying names like water. And in Salem, the name Good never quite disappeared. It faded, but it waited. Some families carried the name West. Others dropped it entirely, and still others discovered it centuries later, in boxes stored in attics, Bibles with folded pages, birth records nearly torn, a single word, Dorcas. One woman in Oregon, tracing her ancestry out of curiosity, found it a child, age 4, Salem, 1692. She stopped scrolling, read it again, and the name reached up, through her screen, like a hand that had never stopped reaching. She booked a flight, not to make a scene, not to claim legacy, just to stand in the place where a child once sat alone behind stone. She brought no flowers, only a letter, folded once. Tucked in her coat, she left it behind a corner of the memorial, didn't read it aloud. But later, someone sweeping the site found it, opened it, and inside, one sentence stood apart. You didn't get justice, but you will not be forgotten. The note was unsigned. Historians still debate how many people today descend from the accused, how many carry the names, or the silence, unknowingly, in their family trees, but names don't need blood to echo. And sometimes, a stranger's grief is enough to complete a story. That year, a candlelight vigil was held, not for the 20 executed, but for those imprisoned and unnamed. They did not list all the names, but someone read aloud. The child who said yes before she knew what was being asked. And those gathered, held their candles a little closer. The wind that night didn't rise. It rested. And so did something deeper. The ache, the guilt, the long, coiled hush of a town that had once forgotten how to say I'm sorry. There are people who do not shout. They do not lead marches or stand at podiums. They sit with thread, or charcoal, or silence, and they mend. And it is these people who, in recent years, have taken up Dorothy's name. A painter in New York hung a portrait once, a canvas almost entirely white, only a small figure near the bottom, barely visible. A child, facing away, one hand outstretched. The title, She Was Only 4. Viewers stood longer than they meant to. Some said it made them uncomfortable. Others said they felt nothing at all, until later, hours after they'd left, the image still pressing on the backs of their eyes, like a forgotten dream trying to return. A poet wrote of her too, in a collection about silence. The lines didn't rhyme. They didn't rise. They curled instead. They named her before she could spell her name. They asked her questions shaped like cages. She answered with her hunger. And in the margins of the museum guest book, people began to leave notes. One simply read, I was 4 when I was blamed for something I didn't do. I forgive her. I forgive me. Historians still debate whether this resurgence of attention to Dorothy Good is projection, myth-making, or necessary reckoning, but few deny its emotional pull. A curator in Salem, who once cataloged only dates and verdicts, now keeps a separate file. Not official, just real. It holds a sketch by a 7-year-old of a girl in a window, a folded napkin with Dorothy written over and over, a photo of a straw doll left anonymously beneath a bench. None of it is archived, none of it displayed, but the curator opens it sometimes, late at night, when the lights are off and the echoes are gentler, and she reads aloud to no one. She was only 4, and the walls seem to listen. There comes a point when a story no longer needs to be told out loud, to be known. It settles instead, into breath, into gesture, into the pause before speaking someone's name. In recent years, Dorothy has appeared not in textbooks, but in the smallest corners of remembrance, a quiet line in a teacher's email signature. She was only 4, a tiny engraving on the bottom of a pendant, worn by a woman who once stood in front of the jail's foundation and didn't speak for a full hour. And in Salem, where her footsteps once echoed in shackles, a garden now grows. It is not labeled after her. It is not shaped like her story. But each spring, beneath a birch tree that bends just slightly toward the east, tulips bloom in a tight circle. 12 of them, always 12. No one planted them, or rather, no one remembers doing so. But every April, they return and no one picks them. Historians still debate whether the tulips were part of an old colonial layout, or simply a gift from birds and wind, but they are always noted, always tended. Sometimes a child visiting the site will sit in their center, not because they know the history, but because it feels safe. A mother once asked her daughter why she chose that spot. The girl shrugged and said, "It feels like someone small is watching the flowers grow." And the mother didn't correct her, because maybe she was right. Maybe Dorothy's story, so often buried in silence and stone, now blooms, not loudly, but faithfully, like the tulips, like breath, not to demand anything, not to haunt, but just to say, "I was here," and slowly, even the village seems to understand that this, too, is history, not the trials, not the verdicts, but the girl behind the whisper, the child behind the name, the one who was only 4. And now, we come to the softest part of the story, the part where names no longer echo, but settle, where even memory, once sharp with sorrow, becomes something smoother, like worn wood, like a lullaby hummed without words. Dorothy's story was never about a trial, or a cell, or even a doll made of straw. It was about what the world does, when it forgets to listen to children, when fear speaks louder than gentleness, when silence is mistaken for guilt, and wide eyes for witchcraft. But that time has passed. The fire is cold. The papers have yellowed. The gallows are long gone. And she, who was only 4, no longer sits behind a door waiting to be named. She is, now, in the places we least expect, in the pause before punishment, in the decision to believe a small voice, in the whisper between generations that says, "We will not forget you again." Sometimes remembering is justice, and sometimes it's just letting a name become soft again. So that tonight, when you close your eyes and the room settles, and no one is asking you to answer anything at all, you might think of her not with sorrow, not with weight, but with the gentlest kind of knowing. She was only 4. She said yes to survive. She held a doll when no one else held her. And now she sleeps. Let her sleep. Let all those who were silenced sleep. The story has been told. The candle is out. The shadows are only shadows now, and the past is quiet, just as she always wished it would be. Shh! Sleep now.